The strange case of the SS Watertown has at its core a prime example of what many believe to be an authentic ghost photograph. The tragic story was recounted by the later well-respected and long-time director of the American Psychical Institute, Dr. Hereward Carrington, who was the young ship's surgeon aboard on his first voyage with the vessel. The account was also detailed in the House magazine of the shipping company, which told of the oil tanker, the SS Watertown, making its way across the Pacific Ocean in December 1924. The ship, owned by the city's service company, was heading from California to Panama under the command of Captain Keith Tracy. Seamen James Courtney and Michael Meehan had been assigned to clean out an empty cargo tank, a menial but tough task generally loathed by crew members and often used as punishment for some misdemeanour. While carrying out this job, the unfortunate pair were overcome by gas fumes and perished before help could reach them. Meehan was assumed to have succumbed to the toxic gases first, as his figure was found with Courtney's draped over it. This was seen as a possible attempt by Courtney to drag his crewmate to safety. Following the tradition of the sea, their bodies were committed to the ocean on December 4th, their weighted remains dropped to the depths below after a simple ceremony. According to recorded accounts, the men's fellow crew members mourned deeply as the pair was said to have been well liked. But the crew were not to be without their deceased colleagues for long. It was the following day when, just before dusk, the entire ship erupted in uproar. The first mate reported to the captain that the heads of the two buried seamen had been clearly seen on board ship and then later in the sea. The crew continued to report seeing the faces of the deceased within the water and waves around the ship. The men's faces would just suddenly appear and bob around in the swill for 5 to 10 seconds before disappearing again. Captain Tracy trained his binoculars on the faces and whispered, "Oh my God!" Eventually the officers and all of the crew had witnessed the incredible sight of the two men swimming in the open sea. When the ship slowed down to 10 knots and drew up alongside the swimmers, they faded like the morning mist, only to reappear just 40 feet away from the ship. At that distance, there were no longer any doubts. The men in the water were definitely Courtney and Meehan. For 3 days, the swimmers kept pace with the Watertown, but now there was no panic or terror aboard the ship. Everyone present had become aware that the apparitions intended no harm. It was later reported that at one point they swam ahead of the vessel and seemed to be trying to divert it from the path of an approaching squall. Later giving an account of the events in the New Orleans office of the ship owners, Captain Tracy informed his employers about the tragic accident and then reappearance of Courtney and Meehan. Tracy was provided with a camera and film and asked to substantiate his claims on the return voyage. The trip back proceeded without incident until the ship entered the Pacific again. The deckhands shouted that they could see two pale figures bobbing in the wake of the Watertown. By dawn, they were once again alongside the vessel, and with the breaking of full light, the captain snapped 6 photographs at close range. The camera and film were then locked away in the ship's safe. Within a few hours, the phantom swimmers had vanished and were not seen again in the days that followed. Once back in port, the captain took the camera, with film intact and untouched inside, to the city service company headquarters. From there it was sent directly to their New York office, where the film was then developed and printed by a commercial photographer. The roll of film was still wet from processing in the photographic laboratory when it was closely examined in the company offices. One by one, the negatives were rejected until one of the executives lifted the 6th frame to the light. "There they are," he said. When prints were made from the negative, the two pale faces emerging from the waves were positively identified by friends and relatives as those of James Courtney and Michael Meehan. They appeared in the photograph exactly as they had been seen from on board ship. According to reports, with subsequent journeys, the faces appeared less often. Eventually, over time, the crew of the SS Watertown changed and there were no further sightings of the faces. Although the eerie photograph was taken in 1924, it was not published until 1934 in the company magazine called Service. By that time, an investigation into the events had begun, but the crew was dispersed and both the first mate and Captain Tracy, who had snapped the image, had passed. The possibly embarrassed company changed the name of the SS Watertown and seemingly lost the original photo and its negative. The sightings had been a big news story in their day, especially amongst sailors. According to one commentator, an enlarged version of the photograph was said to have been hanging on the office wall of a highly placed official of the city's service company for years until it was eventually taken down. There have been some further investigations into the photograph, with some skeptics claiming the apparitions to be a case of pareidolia. This is our human tendency to see a meaningful pattern, such as faces, in a random configuration. This doesn't explain the mass sighting by the whole ship's crew. Others believe there are also some irregularities with the resulting photograph, admittedly produced in a past era from when spiritual fakes were often later exposed. However, many conclude the image to be genuine and not to have been tampered with. In 1963, researcher and writer Michael G. Mann decided to undertake a deeper investigation for an article in Fate magazine. He visited the headquarters of City Go, as the company was now named, and gained access to the infamous photo. He was also able to find out the latitude and longitude of the location where the image was snapped during the voyage. According to Mann, the photograph was analysed for signs of fraud by the Burns Detective Agency and pronounced totally authentic. A scientific reconstruction was conducted for writer Blake Smith's research into the photo. He used the dimensions of a similar ship and two friends to recreate the SS Watertown image, finding that the men's faces appeared in roughly the same spot as where their bodies had been lowered overboard during their burial at sea. However, he found that proportionately, the men's heads were massively larger than real ones. Although Carrington had commented on observing that the heads were somewhat larger than life, the major discrepancy did suggest a faking of the image. However, how and why a whole crew of men, from the captain down, would fabricate such a phenomenon is a mystery, particularly as the company's response was to minimise publicity around the story. Let's face it, the entities, if they existed, were not real men, but ghosts, and they did want to be seen.